Here I am, like I said I'd be, to talk about Vampire Hunter D. I've actually recorded this video once already, and it got screwed, so here I am again. If my voice goes, please forgive me. This is yet another of my relaxed and simple videos, because I'm still dealing with some health problems, and I just don't care enough. But I still want to make some videos and talk with y'all and just have something to do. There's a dog. Lola! Lola! So, we're going to be talking about the first Vampire Hunter D novel. I've been wanting to do a series on all the books. I love them to death. They're like my favorite books ever. My favorite book series for sure. And I think they're really incredible. There's a lot going on in them that I don't think people pay enough attention to, in part because not enough people have read them, and in part because it's like a Japanese sci-fi horror light novel, so nobody really takes it seriously. And I think it's really, honestly revolutionary and really, really cool. And I want to talk about it. So we're going to talk about the first Vampire Hunter D book, which is the weakest, because it's the first one. It was published here in the 2000s, I think 2006, but in Japan it came out in like 1983. It was one of the early books by the author, Kikuchi Hideyuki, Japanese name first. Last name, first name. He was a young men's fiction writer that got started in like 1980 with Demon City Shinjuku, and he's published like 300 books. He's really popular over there, and Vampire Hunter D is probably his most popular book worldwide. So we're going to talk about the first one, which is simply titled Vampire Hunter D. The story opens the only way it possibly could. There's a blood-red sunset over a sea of grass and a lonely, thin road, and there's a horse and a rider. It is the town of Ransilva, Transylvania, and it's a farming town on the frontier, which is kind of described as like a Wild West zone. On the outskirts of this town, our lone rider meets a woman with an untamed aura. She is beautiful, curvaceous, young, powerful. She's everything. But the stranger riding into town doesn't seem to pay her any attention, even when she attacks him with a whip. Then, after failing to get his attention from attacking, she flings her robe off to reveal she is naked. It's an attempt to surprise him, I guess, and take advantage there. But once again, he's still undefeated. And it's a little bit of goofiness that weakens this novel a little. A bit of goofiness that'll show up again a little later. But ultimately, we've had our first female main character and our male main character meet and face off. And the male character is a strange lone wanderer who's incredibly powerful. He is even more breathtaking than her. Like, the narrator describes him as absolutely beautiful, tall, dark, handsome, pale, and melancholy, everything to everyone. At least like 30 times they're gonna call him beautiful in this book. He is amazing. He has a sword, a blue pendant on his chest, and he is a vampire hunter named D. Girl was testing him and is now offering him a job. She runs a local farm, took over after her father's death, and she's being hounded by the local vampire lord. We're getting early examples of how this is a kind of a medieval era in which vampires are lords and nobles, and humans are poor farmers and hunters who are scraping to get by. This vampire lord is Count Magnus Lee. First name is like Latin for powerful. Last name is from Christopher Lee, the vampire, the actor from a Dracula movie. And he wants Doris to become his bride and won't take no for an answer. D is being hired to defeat the vampire lord and save her from becoming his accursed bride. A lot has happened in a very few pages. We've had combat across a bleak wilderness. We've heard there are vampires and monsters, a new civilization blending science and superstition. The entire world has been rewritten in a really simple and straightforward way that grabs your attention like that. As the victim of a bite, Doris should be a mindless strumpet, but she has incredibly strong willpower, which is something the narrative is going to focus on a lot throughout the entire series. The idea that what makes humans more powerful than vampires, what makes them capable of defeating them, is the willpower, a sense of self. There's also this heavy focus on scientific realism. It's a story of magic and myth, but everything is kind of has a plausible explanation with meditations on how monsters function, how weapons work. The nightmare creatures are explained in rational ways, like they're animals, and the science still leaves room for mystery. None of these characters have all the answers, they don't know everything, and there's a lot of contradictions and problems, so it creates a really unique, realistic world that feels like it could be real. So continuing the story, Dee agrees to take on the hunt and work for Doris, and they head to her farm. That night, they are visited by a mechanized carriage with a werewolf named Garou, which is French for wolf, and a vampire lady named Larmica, which is a play on the name Carmilla, early female vampire. Carmilla speaks very haughtily. She looks down her nose at Dee and, oh, you're nothing to me. She's there to look at the human because she's the daughter of Count Lee, and she wants to know what her future stepmom's gonna be like. Dee is able to defeat them and send them running off to Larmica's surprise, and chapter 1 ends. That's a lot of info has been dumped. Not really dumped, but like presented to us in a really neat, well-organized package. It's really poetic, it's really clean, and it feels natural the way that these kind of beats kind of come up organically as we're going through this world and learning different pictures of, like, this is a dystopia, it's scientific, but there's also magic, there's monsters, but the monsters exist because of science, maybe. It's really well done, and it really fleshes out the world and makes it feel real and solid. Yet it also still has that sense of poetry, that gothicness that feels a little otherworldly. It's a little melancholy, it's sharp and slick. The lonely, mysterious rider on the moor. Like, it's so fantastic. And it's interesting that chapter 1 just opens like that with no explanation, but chapter 2 comes back and gives us some explanations for how this world got to how it was. He kind of drops you in media res into the world before stepping back and being all right, hold up. This is what's going on. And it's a really beautiful way to get you hooked on the story. So the information that we learn about this world isn't given to us by characters most of the time. The author goes on these tangents about locations and weapons and monsters, which distantly relate to what's going on, but isn't always connected. And this narrator knows things about the world and about Dee that others don't know. And yet the speaker's also not omniscient, because there are times when it asks, what is Dee thinking? What is Dee planning? It doesn't know everything about the characters. It gives this image of a kind of omniscient figure dictating to us the story of this world, telling us things about this world, but not always knowing what the people in it are going to do. The narrator's almost a character in himself because he speaks so distinctly. It's really interesting. It's a way of giving the reader a lot more information about the world while also creating some isolation from Dee by having this like godly voice that doesn't even know what Dee's thinking. So chapter 2 steps outside the narrative and explains this world. There was an apocalypse in the year 1999, which is a common Japanese trope. Blame Nostradamus. Nuclear war erupted and destroyed basically all life. Humans barely survived, and in the aftermath, vampires arose from the darkness and became the new overlords. That's not how the chapter starts, though. That explanation comes like one page more. Instead, there's this like gothic buildup of a dark age propped up by science, this capital city with technical marvels and global highways that are dust covered because the society that made them is gone. The world is crumbling. It presents us with this hyper-futuristic planet in a deep depression, a society that has achieved greatness it can no longer emulate. The first mention of vampires comes in the form of a mob that is hunting them down. Humans are swarming the city, hunting down the nobles, and the language and the images the author uses pulls on the Dark Ages, on the medieval ages. And the more you pull apart the setting, the more incredible it is. I mean, a vampire dystopia is not unique today. I feel like that's like everywhere now. I'm reading one called Bleeding Mars, like right now. But think about Japan in 1983 when this came out. Vampire Chronicles, Anne Rice, started in the 70s. Most of what I could find of early vamp stuff in Japan was comedies, romances, and shoujo dramas, which I mentioned in a video earlier. In America, there were a lot of movies. There was some blending with sci-fi, but I feel like none of them went as hard and heavy on the sci-fi dystopia as D does, in a really detailed, complex way that kind of reminds me of the author Samuel R. Delany, who is a sci-fi writer that goes really hard into complexities and world building in a way that is sometimes overwhelming. The idea of a world ruled by vampires, a society built on human subjugation, a scientific utopia, which is a social dystopia, that's great already. But VHD goes further by asking what happens when the false utopia falls. Like, there's already all these questions about this scientific world that has fantasy monsters, a future society ruled by monsters, and then the theme of like a collapsing world. How do we rebuild? How do we recreate what we lost? It's so complex and fascinating, and Kikuchi weaves it into this horrifying sci-fi gothic horror epic, just so incredibly unique. In the morning, Doris awakens to see she has a visitor named Greco. He's the mayor's son, and has been demanding that Doris marry him. The mayor is a garbage bag, much like his son, and the two of them are part of a major theme of the series: corruption and power. Vampires are not uniquely evil in this world. Humans with power often abuse it too, especially male humans. Men attempting to force women into relationships using political and social power runs throughout VHD. Greco is one of the more useless examples of this type. His father is Mayor Roman, making this man's name Greco-Roman. So he realizes in this conversation that Doris has been bit by a vampire, and he tries to blackmail her with it, but she's not putting up with it. She's presented as physically stronger than him, knocks him down, uses the whip. She's also mentally and morally better than him. He is a villain, but he's pretty pathetic right now. But his presentation shows the audience how vulnerable Doris is at this moment. She's being hunted by a vampire to be his bride. The mayor's son is pressuring her to be his bride, and she really hasn't got anybody in her corner. Doris's 8-year-old brother, Dan, overhears the conversation with Greco and gets worried about his sister. He runs to Dee and asks Dee to protect Doris against humans and vampires. This is not really in the job description of a vampire hunter, and yet Dee agrees. Now, Doris thinks he's just playing along and being kind to the boy, not trying to hurt him. But we'll see as the story goes on that Dee really does keep to his word and goes out of his way to do more to help the family. And it's a way of showing how, as the narrative expands, Dee is a much better, much moral person, not just physically stronger, but morally better than a lot of the vampires and humans we're gonna see, because he walks the walk. He has power, but he uses it to defend the weak, and he doesn't betray people. He doesn't turn on people. Like, he's just gonna show, even though he is the outsider, he is half vampire, he is strange and distant and violent at times, he is a better person. It's not long before Greco leaves and he comes back with his daddy in a posse, Old West style. The sheriff, the town doctor, they're all there to demand if Doris has been bitten, because villages have procedures. They will lock up victims in the asylum, or they'll exile them, or they'll kill them. Doris refuses, of course, and Greco is riling up the crowd because he can't let this woman win, and that's when Dee appears and cows the crowd with his power and beauty. The sheriff gives some interesting info. He says that there are rumors going around on the frontier about an incredible hunter named Dee, but this is a little contradictory because another line earlier in the book implies that the name Dee is new, that it's something he hadn't used before. I think we can probably assume the author meant to imply Dee already had a legend starting to rise up, and that the name Dee is not his real name. Chapter 3 introduces us to Count Lee's castle. It is absolutely a stroke of genius, blending the theme of toxic nostalgia and gothic intimidation through the vampire culture. They love the past and they can't let it go. So all this modern technology is designed around like old stone castles with lasers and satellites. But, you know, They have to they are so attached to the past, they are so incapable of letting go, that they have to rebuild the world in their image, even when it's self-destructive. The castle has all these barriers to entry, but they are nothing to Dee. He touches the blue pendant on his neck, and the drawbridge opens, and the castle's like, oh, welcome, hey, it's Alexa, I'll help you. This is a pattern that appears throughout the books, the power of the pendant to negate and alter vampiric technology. It's never fully explained, but it is a kind of hint as to the power Dee has and the possible connections that exist in his past. The castle is empty, yet it is meticulously kept by machines. There are gardens growing, statues, and artwork. All the life is gone. So there's this, like, haunting depiction of the foolishness of power and mechanisms. This society is, like, dead. It's dying. And yet the machines are still running. They're still keeping the house clean. You know, so there's this sense of futility and silliness in the way that Dee's walking through this empty castle, and the robots are like, hello, sir, you know. The machines alone lived was a line that I really love from that section. Count Lee is awake when Dee enters the sanctum because he uses a device called time-bewitching incense. It hypnotizes the time so that day is night, night is day. The vampire lord mocks and condescends to his visitor, and he uses the language of power and class. He calls Dee's parents low class, says Dee has forgotten his place, just goes on like a typical self-important, highfalutin jerk. Lormika's there too, but she's more subdued. She was impressed by Dee the night before, and is now trying to convince the hunter to give up on humans and join them. Dee springs from the same noble blood as the vampires. And this is when the narration starts to go into the idea of Damphir, which is what Dee is. He is half human, half vampire. Born of two worlds, at home in neither, but Dee doesn't seem interested in joining the vampires. Lormika grows angry. She starts shouting about humans being menials who destroyed the world, insurgents who overthrew their rightful masters. If the comparison wasn't already clear, we're being hit over the head with it. Vampires are the high class, the moneyed aristocrats feeding on the lifeblood of the poor, destitute humans. The conflict ends abruptly. Count Lee opens a trapdoor and drops Dee into the abyss below, ending the confrontation. He's mostly unbothered by it, though one thing the hunter said lingers in his ears. It's a phrase he heard once before, but he's sure the hunter couldn't have said it. A few things stand out here. The class comparisons, obviously, but also the power dynamics, not just between the hunter and his prey, but the count and his daughter. Lormika is also a vampire, presumably preying on others, but she is also part of a harmful hierarchy. The count has control of her and dictates her life, yet he thinks very lowly of her. The trap that defeated Dee was installed by her, but he didn't give her credit, and the way that he compliments her is always like, my daughter. Like, the only reason that she has value is because that's his daughter. We see traces of the way that the hierarchy's harmful not just to humans, but also to certain vampires, depending on where they are on the social ladder. Just as Dee is having his confrontation with the Count, Doris is having one too. Which portrays just how vulnerable Doris and her brother are. They enter town to try and buy supplies and find no one will sell to them, no one will speak to them, because Greco's been telling everybody, isolate her, do not talk to her, using his social clout to isolate her. Angry, Doris runs off to confront him, and it unfortunately doesn't go well. Earlier, she was portrayed as very powerful, the daughter of a hunter. She knows her way around with a whip. Now, when she goes to use that strength to defend herself against Greco, unfortunately she finds Greco has one-upped her. Using his money and power, he has bought a suit that gives him super strength. And so now she's completely vulnerable to him. The one advantage she had, he was able to buy his way out of, because that's how the system works, She is now at his mercy, and Greco lets her know it. My daddy runs the show in town. Greco tries one more time to convince her to marry him, and obviously she spits on him, as she should, and he decides enough is enough. He's gonna get it. Nothing happens, thankfully, but it's a scene that shows exactly how far society will let him go, because the bartender just shuts the bar down and leaves, doesn't try to do a thing. The implied threat is stopped by a new arrival, however. At first, Doris thinks it's Dee because he's a very handsome man, but it is actually someone named Rei Ginsei, the leader of a group of hunters, and he demands Greco release Doris because she's beautiful. The story is really setting up Rei Ginsei as a kind of foil to Dee. He's a hunter, and he's a human. He's very beautiful, yet there's something off about that boy. And it's clear from the first moment where he saves her for a very stupid reason. And Doris is kind of put off by him, even though she's grateful. Like, she leaves. She is so upset with these dudes and is ready to be done for the day. She can't protect herself or her brother. It's obvious now that the system is just completely upended against her. Her only hope is Dee will return, having completed his mission. Back with Dee, the trapdoor he fell into led into a subterranean aqueduct, something ancient, abandoned, and alien. There are eldritch stones standing out of the water in strange rows. The water is stagnant and black, even though it's supposed to be close to a natural mineral spring. And there are these bones and dead remains floating in the water. There's this very eerie description that gives it an almost Lovecraftian sense of otherness. That doesn't necessarily imply it was vampire-made, but almost made by something else. Something is lingering in the dark. The creature we find is a set of floating female heads, a trio that is evil and enticing, called the Midwich Medusas. The creature is a set of heads on long snake-like necks connecting to a single body. Their long hair acts as a set of tentacles, which wraps Dee up and even goes underneath his clothes and entraps him in an intimate embrace. The sisters, as they're called, bring to mind a lot of different monstrous women in fiction. For one, the three brides of Dracula, women who attempt to feast upon Jonathan Harker, his guest, sexually and physically. These sisters do the same because they feed off of lust and they eat bodies. They're also named for the Gorgon sisters, a trio of monster women from Greek myth, most famously Medusa, the lady with snakes for hair. The design of the creature pulls on other monsters, though, specifically the Greek Hydra from Herculean myth, which is a multi-headed snake-like beast. For every head you cut off, another grows, and it's impossible to stop it. Most variations in the Hydra myths show Hercules using extreme heat to cauterize the necks, and spoiler alert, the Medusas will be killed by a superheated laser. The first part of their name might be a reference to the horror novel The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham, the story of a town whose children are replaced by aliens. Putting all these threads together, Kikuchi creates a uniquely disturbing creature, a thing that mimics the feminine and entices its victims, feeds on the sexually unwilling, and eats their corpses. It's a snake beast, an alien thing with hair tentacles that fill the disgusting waters of the underground aqueduct. It is a fantastic gothic set piece, especially as Dee actually very quickly turns the tables on the creature and seduces it with his beauty, and then hypnotizes it with his bite. This is the first and maybe one of the only times we see Dee feed on something, and it's a monster, not a human. He has no qualms taking over its free will, though he only really uses it to leave the underground. He doesn't feed on it, he doesn't kill it, and he lets it return underground after. Count Lee's the one who kills the Medusas. For the first time, we see the vampire version of Dee using his power to control and defeat others, but the context reveals a world of difference between him and others like him. Dee isn't able to make it back to Doris that night. She returns to the farm and prepares for a night alone, only to receive a surprise guest, Dr. Faringo, a friend of her father's who stood up to the mayor and Greco in Doris's defense. He spends a few hours chatting, shooting the shit until the sun sets, and Doris is like, "Are you gonna head home before it gets dangerous?" And that's when he reveals his plan is to spend the night with her and help protect her. Having spent multiple chapters with, only bad things happening, having a pleasant surprise in the nature of Dr. Ferrigno is just really lovely. He's a guy, he has a figure of power because he's the only doctor in town, and he's choosing to side with her despite the danger to himself, despite the fact that villagers have been warned against helping her. He's a friend of her father's and a former hunter, so he also has some know-how about vampires, and their possible weaknesses. This enters into a really unique piece of world building for this series, the fact that the vampires have weaknesses that humans don't know about. The Doctor's like, how could it be that after centuries of fighting back, certainly humans would have found a weakness of some kind, but they haven't, and the Doctor has theories why. Since the vampires basically bred and changed humankind over the thousands of years, his theory is that they have implanted a kind of psychic block or a psychological repressor that keeps humans from remembering the weaknesses of vampires, specifically the cross and garlic powder. Garlic powder is the theory he wants to test. The problem is, if he uses it against the Count and it works, then the repression effect will immediately remove it from their minds. It's their only hope, though, so that's what they plan to do. It's a fantastic... The suppression of weaknesses is a fantastic piece of world building. It's such a complex idea. It adapts to the ways real-world powerful people control those weaker than them, but also, like, the most powerful and famous of tropes in vampire fiction. So many vampire stories rely on those tropes so strongly, like, they just show up everywhere, that it becomes almost like a deus ex... like an easy way to solve problems. So the fact that these humans don't know what they are means one of the simplest and safest ways of defending yourself is gone, and it makes the stories more complicated, and it also makes the times that they do show up more interesting and rarer. And the fact that Dee's the only one that knows about these things gives them a lot more power. Like, he will do certain things, like in this chapter, he marked Doris on the neck with a mark meant to protect her, but it doesn't say what the mark is, and none of the humans around recognize it. But reading this chapter, you kind of put together, oh, I know what that must be. And it's a really fun way to introduce a concept to the readers and let them kind of figure things out for themselves. Count Lee arrives that night, and Doris has all this technology that she unleashes trying to stop him. Missiles, barriers, electrified nets, nothing works. In the end, he overwrites her will with his hypnotism, and she's going to him willingly, and it takes the Doctor knocking her out to stop him. He does use the garlic and it does work, but unfortunately it's not enough. Only when the Count goes to drink and sees the mark is he repelled and forced to leave for the day. Night passes, morning arrives, and Doris heads out to find where Dee is gone. There's a couple other conflicts. Rei Ginsei and his men are doing some murdering, using an eldritch horror that kills people with, like, looking at it, Lovecraft style. Doris comes across the woman that's summoning the eldritch horror and accidentally interrupts, which kills the woman, and that gets Rei Ginsei's attention. He goes and finds Doris, and on a whim decides to kill her. You know, saved her on a whim, gonna kill her on a whim. It reflects how when power is consolidated into the hands of the few, the whims of the few can change people's lives for horrible, horrible ways. After he's had his fun with her, he says he's going to kill her and believes it is compensation he's owed for saving her. A day has passed, and he's gone from defending her to killing her, because power is fickle and unfair. The only reason she survives is because Dee arrives. It is all solely down to luck. Not merit, not fairness. That's how survival in the frontier is. A brief scene in the vampire's castle reveals Count Lee murdering the Medusas, followed by a conversation with Larmica. She's still against bringing Doris into the family, doesn't want a human woman around, but Count Lee doesn't care. He defends himself by comparing it to the sacred ancestor who had a human lover. Sacred ancestors, the ancient primordial vampire who once ruled all of the world. Obviously, it's Dracula. It's Dracula. The human woman he loved was Mina the Fair, and she was from the Land of Angels, which apparently was kind of a mistranslation of Ingalls, which was meant to be a corruption of England. It's Dracula. Dee and Doris return to the farm. The girl is exhausted. She's had some rough days. So she lays down to rest, and Dee takes over the farm. It's not exactly part of his job, but he willingly, without being asked, steps in to take care of their responsibilities. It's not something even the Doctor offered to do. He's assisting in their survival by caring for the household. Every action Dee takes aligns him with the protection and the survival of people who are vulnerable to the powers that be. More machinations begin to occur. Rei Ginsei aligns himself with Count Lee. Greco overhears them and starts plotting his own plots. And the next morning finds Dan, Doris's brother, has been kidnapped in order to separate Dee from Doris. The two of them re-enter town, heading to Dr. Ferrigno's house, where Doris will remain while Dee seeks out Dan and takes on Rei Ginsei and his allies. Ginsei plans to use Dee to kill his allies, so that he's the only one who survives to be transformed into a vampire by the Count. The Count probably plans to abandon Ginsei once he's served his purpose, both of them using each other, lying to their associates, and completely incapable of sincerity. The Doctor and Doris head out on the wagon together into the wilderness, because the Doc has a theory that there's a location around somewhere that'll protect her from vampires. They never make it there. Larmika shows up out of the darkness, stopping the cart, and reveals that the Doctor is no longer human. Unfortunately, he was turned the night before, and Doris's only human ally has become an enemy. He stuck his neck out to protect her, and he got bit. That's twice that someone who formerly protected her has become a threat to her life. She's not having a good time. The Doctor speaks of Doris horrifically. He mentions that he remembers feeling she was like a daughter to him, but now he just wants that booty and that blood. Larmika, however, just wants Doris dead. She refuses to allow the noble blood of her lineage to be sullied by a human woman, regardless of what her dad wants. What stops her is Greco using the time-bewitching incense to render her harmless. It's not a change of heart. Once again, it's a bad character behaving in a good way for selfish reasons, trying to bind Doris to him and force her to marry him. Doris is grateful to be saved, but she turns on Greco when he starts considering using Larmika as a hostage. She despises vampires, but Larmika hasn't done anything to her yet, and she doesn't want to hurt someone who's defenseless. So Doris defends Larmika from Greco, Larmika returns the favor by attacking, and Doris is forced to try and flee when the Count arrives. Elsewhere, Dee has defeated Rei Ginsei and his allies. Ginsei, however, survives by betraying his new boss and revealing to Dee that Doris is in danger. When the hunter finds out that the Doctor is now a vampire, he's so overcome by remorse, it actually shows on his face because he personally escorted her to the Doctor. He turns to leave, only for Ginsei to speak again, asking if Dee will join him. Sure, he betrayed his human allies and his vampire allies, but this time it's for real. What gives the vampires their power, Ginsei asks. It's the castles and the culture of fear which has been spread for thousands of years. He makes some good points. Vampires are weaker than they've ever been. There are more humans than there have ever been, and it wouldn't take much for humans to overcome them. Fear and oppression are what keep them in line, and rather than undo that culture, Ginsei wants to unseat the vampires and do it himself and be the monster tormenting everybody else. Tale as old as time. Dee wants nothing of it. He cuts off Ginsei's left arm and leaves him behind, arriving just in time to save Doris from the Count again. The Count still tries to go for Doris, but she stands her ground and says she'll off herself right this moment rather than become a vampire. And that stuns the Count. He holds off, and in denying the man her life, Doris reclaims some of her power over her own body, even if it's, violence towards herself. And it kind of reveals a little bit of the helplessness and the pathetic element of the Count in that he is so obsessed with this girl, so unable to stop thinking about her. Like, he cannot do what he wants because he can't risk her being hurt. Like, he is not as overwhelmingly powerful as he seems. Dee and Doris leave with Greco and Larmika in tow. Larmika kind of pulls a Doris and says, kill me now. Don't pollute me with the presence of humans, which pisses Doris off. But Larmika doesn't care. She goes off on a tangent that is all about how the nobility are the ruling class, and it entitles them to certain things. Namely, complete control over lives and deaths. She says humans should feel lucky they were allowed to live at all, and she uses Greco and his selfish behavior as an example for why all humans suck. But Doris claps back. If you're such great rulers, what do you want with me? Pointing out that Count Lee is like a dog in heat sniffing around her, and that the vamps must be hard up for women if they ought to go looking in the gutter for wives. The verbal smackback hits hard, and it's the first time humans have been allowed to speak back on this idea of vampires as innately better than humans, and it's done so beautifully. If the vampire is so powerful, why is he so helpless in the face of his desire for a woman he claims is lesser than him? Dee chimes in too and says the sacred ancestor didn't feel the way Larmica does about humans. He mentions the cosmic principle, but doesn't really elaborate on what that is. Larmica calls him a lowly creature that couldn't possibly know the sacred ancestor, but the way Dee speaks about it has shaken her. Once again, we're given a hint that Dee and this ancestor have something in common. Another lull in action leads to Dee working on the farm, and it makes Doris wonder what kind of family the hunter was from. What had his life been like? It makes her yearn for this life to continue forever, the two of them working on the farm, caring for Dan. But she knows it's not to be, and it hurts to think of how short this time with Dee will be. The impermanence, the fleeting nature of Dee's relationships with others begins to rear its head. Dee and Doris have a romantic moment beneath the sunset. It comes close to physical. Dee resists the desire to drink her blood, and the unfulfilled tension of the moment highlights the tragic, ephemeral nature of it all. That night, a mob shows up from town, heralding a dark turn. The doctor's gone. The sheriff is the sole support Doris has, but he has a responsibility of the whole village. Unfortunately, the vampire curse has spread, and others, including children, have been bit. The Count threatens to harm more of the people if they don't turn Doris over. Leading the mob, of course, are Greco and Rei Ginsei, driven by a desire for vengeance against Dee and to take Doris, describing the woman as literal property to be owned. All that stands between the girl and the mob is Dee, who Ginsei challenges to a duel. Of course, they're not playing fair, they're cheating. So Ginsei defeats Dee and stabs him in the heart, seemingly killing him before cutting off the hunter's left hand as vengeance for his own injury. The hunter is left behind. The village takes Doris and Dan and imprisons them in the asylum. This is where the narrative takes a unique turn, revealing a secret that's been in hiding all this time. Dee hears strange voices, and he seems to have an invisible partner always around. Until now, we had no idea who it was, but after Dee's death, the hunter's left hand starts moving on its own. Named Left Hand by the fanbase, the creature is a strange parasitic being, a countenanced carbuncle that lives in Dee's hand. This seems to be a voluntary relationship. Dee asks if the creature is tired of hanging around and wants off, but it refuses. And the symbiotic nature of it is revealed here in Dee's seeming final moments. What would have been deadly to any other Dhampir is a mere flesh wound for Dee, because the left hand is able to heal him. It uses the energy of other life forms, fire, water, air, and earth, the elements of Western alchemy, transforming that energy into power for Dee. This secret, which Dee never reveals to others, is the crux of his power and his role as a hero in the narrative. Other characters are slimy, backstabbing, selfish. They only stand for themselves, so they live and die alone, often failing in their goals specifically because all they do is betray, lie, and use and abuse others. Doris is safe because she teams up with the Doctor and with Dee, and they work to protect each other. Dee himself is not a solo act. Here we see the narrative presenting us with the sole opposition to power: unity. Dee lives because he's not alone, and Doris will live because Dee is not going to abandon her. While Dee is recovering, Doris and Dan are in the asylum, vulnerable to the whims of the mayor and his ilk. Greco tries to take advantage, of course, but is stopped by Larmica, of all people. Larmica tells Doris to take the chance to run while she can. This novel is full of twists and turns and the loyalty of its characters. The same people hurting Doris and saving Doris over and over, but this particular change is pretty significant. Before, characters who were allies became enemies and remained enemies, only acting in their self-interest. Here, an enemy becomes an ally in order to return a kindness. This is more of that unity theme, where Doris defended Larmica when she was helpless, bringing Larmica to return the favor, regardless of her feelings for Doris and humanity. Unfortunately, the escape is short-lived because the Count arrives, taking Doris and his daughter, who is severely punished back at the castle. The Count prepares for his wedding in the basement, surrounded by coffins which seem to house vampires which may or may not be in some kind of hibernation. There's a giant portrait of the ancestor on the wall, seeming to stand in for a priest, and Doris, dressed in white and hypnotized to keep her will subdued. Dee heads to the castle to save her after a final short battle with Rei Ginsei. He dies, lamenting his humanity, while Dee's kind of like, it'd been nice if you were, less shitty and not just beautiful. The Count and Dee have a final showdown in which the Count talks about how all of this is the vampires' due. Immortal life, freedom to do whatever they want. Dee responds, "Transient guests are we." It's the same line he said earlier, which was first spoken by the sacred ancestor, and it shocks the Count. He can't believe that the ancestor and this stripling could be related. These 4 words reflect everything about the vampiric world. They are not immortal, they are fading. Everything ends, and prolonging that artificially isn't going to change that. The world will belong to humans soon, and Dee's working to ensure it's sooner rather than later. He defeats the Count, and the castle begins to fall apart. Larmica appears, revealing she set the place to blow, and she plans to go down with the ship. But she asks Dee one thing before it all ends. Is he related to the sacred ancestor? Dee's answer is lost in the chaos. Outside, Dee rides into the wilderness while Doris and Dan are safe on the other side of the destroyed castle, watching him go, mourning the short time they had with him. A little bit of that 80s goofiness comes back here, because Doris is all like, now that I've known the company and the assistance of a man, I can never go back to being alone and working individually. And then her brother's like, 8-year-old brother, well, that's okay, sister, because I am now a man, and I will take over as head of the household and lead the way. And Doris is like, yes, you are a man. It's going to be okay. And it's all real weird. Like, the idea that because she has had companionship, she can never again be an individual person is real weird. But it's kind of tied into the themes that this story pulls off of. Westerns, Gothic novels, a lot of them are really heavily reliant on the idea of a woman who ends up in a partnership with or the protection of a man because she cannot survive on her own. It's a weird ending, and it has a weird beginning, but the middle of it, all of it, is just so incredibly unique and well done, and there's so much good meat on the bone that is improved upon and really developed as the rest of the series goes on. I honestly love this book and this series, and I think it's really worth consideration, and there's a lot more going on in it that people miss. The basic plot of this novel is a Gothic novel and a Western. A Gothic novel in the sense of the oldest kind of vampire novels where the story's centered on a predatory man or woman coming after a innocent woman who is protected by male figures in her life. Varney, the vampire, very popular in his day, hunted Clara and Flora. Carmilla, female vampire, hunted Laura. Dracula was after Mina and Lucy. I don't know what's with all the A names. All of those stories were about male violence and male guardianship, in a sense, using the woman as a symbol of various things that needed protecting. Typically femininity, society, are women. At different times, the threat was a poor man. Later, it was a rich man and a foreign man and a rich foreign man. But the idea was, the theme underneath it was the fear of the other that is going to come and take our women. And through women, the bloodline, which is, who your children are, changing what your culture is. The fear that some foreign thing is going to come in and change your bloodline and the color of your people and all of that. And then you got Westerns. The basic Western plot. A lot of the movies I grew up watching with my dad were a lone rider comes to town and finds an individual woman who's been abandoned by society in some way and is in danger and needs help, and the handsome man saves her, probably marries her in the end, or maybe rides off into the sunset. And those two stories, vampire hunting down woman, lone woman in need of defense from lone rider, the two of them come together to make Vampire Hunter D. But here's the crux. How do those stories differ from this one? Because it's not a one-to-one, you know. In those novels, the women, specifically Gothic novels we'll talk about. I don't know as much about Westerns because I've never really cared about them. Women in Gothic novels don't have a lot of agency back in like the 18th, 19th, you know, older original novels, which inspired a lot of the later movies that came out in like the 70s and 80s. They are not active in the story. They are people to be protected who are often unconscious, maybe not there, just around to be victims, to give the story a symbol to protect. Doris is the active figure in this book. She hires Dee. She's physically capable, does some fighting of her own. She's physically capable in that she's a farmer running a farm. She's a mentally capable person where she says things, stands up for herself. Some of the best lines in the book are hers. She's a person. She is not just a thing or a symbol being protected, and she's not being protected in a kind of chauvinistic way of, like, usually in the stories, it's a husband, a brother, a father. There's a kind of ownership present in those stories that isn't here, because Dee is doing this at her, behest, and doing it because it's the right thing to do. You could maybe see some threads of this in the way that Dan asks for her to be defended, in the way that Dan says, you know, now I'm the grown-up. There's a little bit of leftover piece of that thread of, like, ownership and kind of chauvinism there. But it disappears pretty quick in the series, and it's so thin. And the rest of what's done with Doris is so much better that I tend to forgive it. Because Doris is a much more interesting character than a lot of the female characters from Gothic novels. And she has so much more to do and say. And so much of the novel is about highlighting how she is a vulnerable figure and why she is a vulnerable figure. It's not just the vampire hunting through the shadows. It's when society gives all of its power to a corrupt mayor, then anyone that mayor and his family don't like is going to suffer. And it shows the societal implications of power, social power, physical power, money power, all of that in The Vampire, in Rei Ginsei, in Greco, different ways that powerful men can oppress and hurt vulnerable women. That narrative is pretty much central to all of the VHD novels, sometimes towards men, sometimes towards women. Typically, it's two angles. Class, in the way that vampires hunt all humans, reflecting kind of aristocratic relationships, and gender, male humans and male vampires typically going after women. That's not always universal, but 9 out of 10 of the novels deal with that. And it's done in a way that really reflects the humanity of the women and the innate kind of poison at the center of the society, in that it has been allowed to become like this, to kind of corrupt all these people and create all this suffering. And because of that, that's why this society is wrong and why it has to kind of be fixed. The fix doesn't come overnight, you know. All this, through the different books, we see many characters kind of dealing with the problems of the society and wanting to fix it and change it, and slowly kind of making impressions there. But there's this definite sense of illness that needs cured, and Dee is part of the cure in how he behaves and how he acts and how he sides with the victims all the time. And it's really well done. And I think a lot of people miss that, because there's this idea that if a story has something, that implicates it in supporting it. Just because a story has certain themes doesn't mean that the author's like, that's cool. You know, even when it can feel like it's gratuitous, even if it feels like it's titillating, that doesn't mean the author's like, yeah. You know, a work of fiction is both escapism, and it's meant to entertain, and it's meant to educate in a sense. And so stories can end up doing all three of those things. Some people may not get all three of those things. Some of them might fly right over their heads, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the author's like doing bad shit. This is definitely the weakest of all the books, but it's got all of the framework of what's going to make the other books great. What comes in is a lot of mystery. The first book is basically straightforward. We know who the enemy is and why they're the enemy. That won't be the case by book 2. There will be a lot more mystery, a bit of kind of detective work built in there. Not every novel has it, but a lot of them do. more complex plot lines come in, some longer plot lines, and some story beats that will repeat in a way that kind of feels like the author's building to something, so that there's this bigger narrative built on the smaller pieces of this story. It's incredible, and I hope you'll hang in there with me and watch more videos about it, because I'm definitely going to do more. Other news, unfortunately, my VHD videos have been claimed and taken down worldwide, which sucks because they were my most popular videos in a long time, and I've lost all those views now. I'm going to re-upload them, I'm going to edit them, but they may not get as many views because people have seen them already, and that's upsetting. So if you liked it, please watch it again and share it with your friends. You know, I will post when I've uploaded it again, and hopefully we can get the videos up again. Because that really hurts YouTubers when they have a successful video and YouTube just takes it. That hurts. So, anyway, thanks for watching. I'll keep y'all posted, and see you next time.